specifically has been driving the prison growth in that state, using that data to then formulate policy based on research about what works and doesn't work in other states, and then driving that forward usually through legislation. So between the 35 or so states that have gone through the justice reinvestment process, and what California has done, what New York has done separately, and other states, we've had a drop-off in the national prison population and the imprisonment rate overall. We peaked and the rate in 2008 at about 1 in 100 adults behind bars at prison and jail. And that has now fallen back to about 1 in 113, the latest numbers in 115, about 11% drop off. There's already a goal out there that we should cut 50, and a lot of people are shooting for that as a marker. We haven't cut 50 yet, but we cut 11, and things seem on that front to be generally headed in the right direction. That's of course part of the story. The other part is the conversation that just happened in the room before us about crime. As you all well know, crime has come down as well. In fact, if you look at that 2008 marker, imprisonments come down 11%. You have a 23% reduction in the combined violent and property crime rates over that period of time, notwithstanding the uptick in violent crime the last couple of years. So I'm going to use that as a sort of a jump-off point to get to the question, Marty, that I think you're really looking for me to address, which is sort of why is this happening? How we got to a point, particularly in the heartland, the rest of the country, to where so many states have taken, in many cases, pretty dramatic steps to avert the prison growth that they were going to see if they hadn't done anything, and actually bend that curve down. And we really see three things, three main buckets, three main reasons why this is happening. The first is the success of states in actually reducing crime and incarceration at the same time, and particularly the success of Texas in doing that. We've talked about it's come a couple times today. New York has done it too. The thing about Texas is that it's Texas, right? And I know we have a couple who's here from Texas, and we have Austin, and some Texans here. It's hard to overstate. I would say it's almost impossible to overstate the impact of what happened in Texas now 10 plus years ago on the overall national debate and discussion, right? Texas is a very symbol of law and order in this country. Texas is not going to do anything people think that would be soft on crime. And so the fact that Vikrant and the Texas Public Policy Foundation and the progressive group on the ground there in Texas, Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, and others got together around a change in direction in Texas in 2007, and really just slammed the brakes on the prison growth there. Right? Texas was a state that went from 50,000 prison beds to 150,000 prison beds from 1987 to 2007. So 20 years, 100,000 prison beds, growing at a clip of 5,000 more beds a year, and then it stops on account of the alternative programs that were put into place. And it's worked. The incarceration rate in Texas is down 20%, more than that national average, and the crime rate in Texas is down by 30% over that period of time. And so the fact that this has happened in Texas, even if the state didn't do the same kind of intensive sentencing reform that many other states have now, has been a big part of why so many other policymakers in other states feel like they have political permission to make reforms. The second bucket is a very supportive political atmosphere and environment, generally speaking. A big part of that is certainly the conservative leadership that has emerged on this. We saw that again at lunch today, and the larger Right on Crime movement and a number of organizations and real top conservative thinkers, whether it's been Grover Norquist or David Keene or Ralph Reed and others from sort of across the conservative political spectrum who have come out in support of reforms, and the public support as well. It's been about 8 years or so now that we did our first poll. We didn't start off our project at Pew doing polling and figuring out what was going to sell or anything like that. We started doing the work based on research and data. And then as we started to see the public support, we said, hey, we should document this and actually get a measure of how supportive people are. And when you do the polling going back 8 years, and there's been a bunch of polling that's come out more recently, you find that broad swaths of the public are supportive of the general concepts of moving lower level offenders from prison into alternatives. And you find very high levels of support across political party affiliation, across ideology, for specific policy prescriptions as well. So it's not just general vague abstract concepts, but when you actually say, should we take a year off these types of offenders' sentences and make sure that they have post-prison supervision as opposed to putting them on the street after they've maxed out without any supervision at all, you're in 70+% support for that, often more than 50% of people saying they strongly support these kind of policies. The third big bucket, and this is the nerdy bucket, but we think it really underlies this, and that is the real explosion of research that points the direction toward programs that actually work and stop the cycle of recidivism. When we started down the prison building path 40 years ago, we didn't know a heck of a lot about what actually worked. There's been a tremendous amount of research in the interim that identifies how you can break this cycle. No magic bullets. I wish we had some, but with respect to policymakers being in a place in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s where it was like, well, we're not going to put people in prison. What are we going to do with them? There are now some very concrete programs and policies and some very concrete research that back up what you need to do. You need to use a validated risk assessment to help identify specifically what's driving people's behavior. You need to match that person to the right type of programs. Those programs need to be responsive to offenders' particular needs and learning styles, and so on. There's sort of a battery now of credible alternatives that didn't exist back in the day. You put all those three things together, and you layer on top this issue of spending that you heard before. States have to balance their budgets, unlike the federal government, and I think that's, Marty, what we've seen in terms of the formula here for why there's been so much activity and success on this front around the country.
Thank you. Vikrant, perhaps you can offer some thoughts on the work you've been doing, as Adam did, specifically thinking about a broader definition of heartland perhaps than I have, but also as it intersects with this opioid epidemic and increasing drug use, and how that has affected your efforts and your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what I'm going to try and do is reassure everybody that everything Adam said is correct. And here's what I mean by that. It would be perfectly fair to say, well, Mr. Gelb, that all sounds well and good, and that all applied up until 2016. But during the presidential campaign, we saw a lot of rhetoric from conservatives that was discouraging, that made us think that all of the excitement and enthusiasm for criminal justice was starting to ebb. I don't think that's true. I think it's a fair question. In fact, it's a question that we had at the Charles Koch Institute. So we decided to try and study it. We did a poll not too far after the presidential election had concluded to try and get a sense of how conservatives were thinking about criminal justice. And I'm very happy to report that we found 81% of respondents who identified themselves as Trump voters said that they still found that criminal justice was either a very important or somewhat important issue in American politics. They really, really seemed to care. And as we started digging down into the figures, we got a stronger sense of, I think, what was driving that. And I think it's the kinds of things we're talking about at this conference today and tomorrow. It's questions about ways in which the heartland has been ignored. We noticed, for example, this statistic really stood out to me, that 54% of these people who had identified themselves as Trump voters said that they knew somebody who was either presently incarcerated or who had been incarcerated. Now, I think some people, by the way, I should note, this was even higher than the the numbers for Clinton voters. Within margin of error, I think the Clinton voters is 52 or 53%, something like that. But it was, I'm sorry, my phone is buzzing. But nevertheless, it was a very, very high figure. And some people might say, that seems unusual. How can Republicans know people behind bars? They're all rich monopoly men with top hats and monocles. That's not reality. You guys know, because you're knee-deep in the criminal justice system, that the system is so broad and so vast that it affects just about everybody. There are estimates out there, we don't actually know the number, but there are estimates that 1 in 3 Americans may be walking around with some kind of a criminal record right now. Knowing somebody who has been incarcerated absolutely transcends party. And my hunch is that if you're living in the heartland, if you're in rural America, which Donald Trump won commandingly, he won 62% of voters in rural America, you may feel that in some ways your community had been left behind because so much of the attention was going to urban areas. I'll give you a small example of the way in which attention would go to urban areas. And it's not a criticism, it's just an explanation of how these kinds of things work for perfectly rational reasons. Adam talked about how Texas started to really take off with criminal justice reform in 2007, and that is the key year. There are a few things that happened earlier than that. For example, I think in 2001, 2003, something like that, there was a bill that went through the Texas legislature that required drug courts to be placed in the 5 largest cities in Texas. That's Dallas, Fort Worth, where I'm from, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. And that was good, because 80% of Texans live in one of those 5 cities. That said, there's another 20% who live in places like Tyler and El Paso and Corpus Christi and Brownsville who weren't captured by that piece of legislation. Now, government resources are limited, they're scarce. You have to do what you can do first, focus on the biggest part of the problem. It's not a criticism of what the Texas legislature passed or what Governor Rick Perry signed. It's just an observation about how these resources are going to cities. People out in the rural heartland may have felt like they were left behind. I'll close with one final observation about heartland and politics in the middle of the country right now and criminal justice. The most interesting election result to me, other than obviously the result of the presidential election, that night in November came out of Oklahoma. Oklahoma had this referendum that would have reclassified a number of felonies as misdemeanors. There's a lot of drug crimes. And that referendum won. And it won in a state that voted for Trump more than just about any other state in the country. The Trumpiest states in America were West Virginia and Wyoming in terms of percentage of people who voted for Donald Trump. And number 3 was Oklahoma. It is hard to get Trumpier than Oklahoma. And yet, those Oklahomans went out there and said, it doesn't seem to make sense that for a number of these drug crimes, people are being locked up behind bars for a number of years because we're classifying them as felonies. These things need to be reclassified as misdemeanors. So I really think that in the heartland where, the number of deaths from opioid addiction is now larger than the number of deaths from automobile accidents, terrifying figure, and where, by the way, there was an awful story in the New York Times this week about how meth is making a comeback in the heartland, where a lot of these problems have festered for many, many years. There was some deep frustration. But it's an opportunity because, for better or for worse, there is an administration right now that people in rural America they appreciate, and the people in the White House are in a position where if they want to continue to appeal to these voters, they're going to need to do something about it. They're going to need to do something about the opioid crisis. They'll need to do something about the reemerging meth crisis. They'll need to do something about the very high rates of unnecessary incarceration and inadequate rehabilitation and mental health services and job training that's taking place in these criminal justice systems. So that is my general sense of the heartland criminal justice outlook right now. So in short, Adam was correct. He's still right.
Thank you. Mr. Singleton, so we heard a lot this morning. Ohio obviously is a state that has been very hard hit by the opioid epidemic, but a state also where a Republican governor took the Medicaid expansion monies and has advanced some policies that were well regarded So perhaps you could give us a more granular view from the ground about what's happening in Ohio, which is very much the heartland.
I want to start by saying how grateful I am to be in Ohio, because I didn't like it at first. I was miserable there at first when we moved in 2001 there. And I used to look out at these buildings here, because I was in New York after I graduated from law school and then was in DC, and went kicking and screaming with my wife to Ohio. And part of what the challenge was for me was the politics. I was comfortable in my bubble here in New York, my progressive bubble. And I want to echo what's been said about the opportunity. There's so much opportunity in the heartland to work across the political spectrum to get good work done. I love it there now, partly because of that. We can't write people off based on how they vote. We have to be open to differences and find ways to work together. That said, it's frustrating right now in Ohio around criminal justice reform. When I started at OJPC in 2002, we had 35,000 people in our state prison system. And in 2011, when we embarked on Justice for Investment, we had 50,500, somewhere in that range, in 33 prisons. And just to give you some perspective, go back 20 years, we had 10,000 prisoners in 10 institutions. So it really exploded over the years. We were so hopeful about Justice for Investment. And it didn't pan out exactly as we wanted, and mainly because of the judges. One of the elements of Justice for Investment that was passed into law was discouraging, and in some instances prohibiting, sentencing courts from sending low-level, nonviolent folks who committed felonies to prison. And the way that the judges got around that was they wound up putting people on probation, and then as soon as there was a problem with probation in terms of a technical violation, they would yank the probation and send them to prison. So each year, we've got about 4,700 people who come in to our state prison system based on technical violations of probation. So that's a problem. So today, we were hoping that Justice for Investment would substantially reduce our state prison population. We're at 49,600 today. So it's not that much different than it was in 2011. One of the things that's happening on the ground right now in Ohio, and my organization is part of it with the Alliance for Safety and Justice and also the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, we are running a California-style ballot initiative in Ohio. And what we are going to ask the voters to approve is a bill that will do 4 things. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to reclassify drug possession offenses that are felonies, reclassify those to misdemeanors, and apply it retroactively. So that's the first thing it's going to do. The second thing it's going to do is prohibit judges from sending people back to prison on technical violations of probation. And obviously there are going to be some exceptions to that for certain categories of crimes. But non-violent, low-level offenses, and people commit them, are not going to be going back, if this passes, for technical violations of probation. The other thing it's going to do is it's going to expand earned credit for folks who participate in programming. So under the earned credit provision, for every 2 days of programming, you get a day off your sentence with up to a 25% cap on your sentence. 25% of your sentence you can get earned credit. And then last but not least, the savings that we anticipate will be about $100 million a year will be put into drug treatment. 70% of it will go to drug treatment to respond not just to the opioid crisis. Let me just say that because yeah, the opioid crisis is serious, but it's offensive if we're predominantly concerned with opioid addiction, which overwhelmingly affects white folk, and we didn't give a damn when it was crack cocaine in the 80s. That's offensive. So it's not limited to opioid addiction treatment, but it will involve providing more dollars for treatment of people who are addicted, regardless of what the addiction is. And then 15% of that money will go to trauma recovery services for survivors of crime. And then another 15% will go to make the existing system that we have responsive to those two goals, better responsive to those two goals of treating addiction and helping people heal who've been the survivors of crime. So that's what's coming on to the ballot in 2018. Stay tuned to see what happens in Ohio. I am optimistic that we will get across the finish line on that. And I am optimistic that we will continue to find ways to work across the political spectrum in the heartland and also specifically in Ohio to get sensible criminal justice reform done. So that's the view in Ohio.
Thanks. Let me just ask one follow-up question. So Ohio is interesting. We talk about it as the heartland, but it's made up of some cities, densely populated industrial areas, and some very rural areas. Are the issues different?
Yeah, it's, let me tell you who's getting hammered right now in terms of harsh sentencing around drug offenses. It's people in rural communities because the judges there don't have the resources to deal with the issues. And so they're slamming people. And I think that's a huge opportunity. I don't feel good about that. Don't get me wrong here, but there's an opportunity to find ways to build bridges between those in our urban core and those in rural communities around justice reform. Yeah, the issues are different in that one respect.
Thanks. So Leann, you've been working for a fair number of years now to reform things in North Dakota in terms of sentencing policy and the use of imprisonment, and have met with some success. But North Dakota, I think, is different than Ohio, right? So my recollection is that it could be 9 miles between farms, right? Or I guess you call them ranches out there.
Farms and
right.
ranches.
And it's a state, right, that you've got serious drug problems. You had a serious meth problem before, and also a state that's been hard hit economically, right?
As of recently.
Yeah. So could you talk about what you face and really tell us a little bit about the work you've done and the struggles that you face and the headwinds that you encounter?
Sure, I don't think you get much more rural than North Dakota. It's a very red state, and so there's not a lot of, should I say, the attitude is you're good old Germans and Norwegians, and by God, if you have an issue with drug addiction, you pull yourselves up by the bootstraps and get over it. And so it's interesting. It's a very small system, and I'd like it to keep a very small system. But we were one of the fastest growing state populations as far as corrections population. So to put it in perspective, over the last 20 years, our state only grew about 18% in population. Incarceration grew about 250%. And if you break that down over that same period of time, the women that were incarcerated grew by 600%. Now these are small numbers, right? But it's still a huge percentage increase. And so I was advocating for criminal justice reform before it was popular. And I say before it was popular because before the oil downturn, North Dakota didn't really face a recession. So the rest of the states were having budget crunches. We were rolling in the dough, right? And so there was no sense of urgency to reduce the corrections budget because it was just like, well, we can't control that. Let's just build more jails. Let's build more prisons. And so finally, the downturn hit the state very, very hard. So it wasn't just oil that took a dive. We're very heavily dependent on commodities, the farm commodities and the oil commodities. So our budget took a downturn. And finally, what usually talks to conservatives is the money factor. So there was good work going on and they had passed a few things, but at the same time, it was very, very difficult to advocate for incarcerating fewer people because during that oil boom, we were seeing a significant increase in crime. And this is finally, we are experiencing a little downtick in crime, but we were experiencing an uptick in crime, although other states were actually seeing a downturn. And we saw a significant spike in violent crime. Now, that's not rare when you think about what an oil boom does to a state. Who do you think comes into the state? A bunch of 20-somethings, okay? The highest crime-producing population. So a bunch of young males, and there weren't enough women, and so very kind of disproportionate women-male mix in the oil field. Nothing to do, lots of money in their pocket. It was a combination for a spike in crime. And then, of course, it was highly publicized. So not only did we have people who were looking for legitimate jobs, we had all the people saying, hey, we can come sell our drugs for 3 times as much in the oil fields of North Dakota. So it was a recipe for, we just need to build. So over the last 10 years, not only were prison beds added, but the jail building really, really hit hard. So there's a lot of jail beds being built. And so when you start talking about the harm of what incarceration does, and that we actually can't afford to do this any longer, there's a dynamic that I faced because counties, well, half of our counties looked at those jail beds as economic development, knowing that if people were sentenced to the state Department of Corrections, that if we were out of room, we'd send them back to the counties and pay them a per diem. So it was economic development for their local county. And of course, the federal system as well, the Marshal Service and ICE were using those beds too. So it ended up being economic development at the local level. But when the budget took a boom, they finally had to get serious. And we were fortunate enough to become a justice reinvestment state. And so we had made some progress before that, but when CSG came in, Council of State Governments came in to work with our state on it, one of the things that I think was interesting for us is that when everything does, when all you have a hammer, everything does look like a nail. And so one of the things our department had done well is we did really, really well with providing services within our prison system. We were the default mental health provider, the default addiction services, so that 70% of our district court judges said they were sending low-risk, nonviolent people to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation just to access services. So I think that got people's attention that it was not only the wrong thing economically, it was the wrong thing for the human aspect. Because at the same time, when the opioid epidemic really hit North Dakota, we also saw that a lot of parents were now being sent to prison to access treatment, and the spike in foster care was going up, and the cost across state government was going up because of these issues. So we were successful, and I would say one of the biggest pieces that we got passed during the legislative session that is actually now we are seeing a downward bend in our population. So the same time last year, we had 4% more people incarcerated. And if we look at the women, we had 20% more people incarcerated at the same time. So we're seeing a downturn. not because of all these reforms taking effect so much, as the recognition and the awareness. And one of those pieces of legislation that I got really proposed is that I got the legislature to say, correctional resources are finite. We can't continue to use them like they're infinite. And so they actually put in our appropriation bill, and I got accused of putting policy in our appropriations bill, but they do it all the time. So that's where it got put. We got language that said the State Department of Corrections has the right to refuse admission of inmates once we reach maximum operational capacity within our facilities, and once we reach appropriated levels for contracted housing. And I also went to work for a new governor who's been in his first year. He decided it was worth spending some political capital and supporting that with the recognition that we needed to find savings. We also gave that same authority to the county jails. And I said, we can save $7.5 million by giving us that cutoff.
Kathleen Maurer, and she's asked to stand up here. Wait, here you can use it. And she's going to talk about her work in a state that is very interesting because it has all the problems of the heartland, even though it's very much considered part of the East Coast elite, and she works in the Connecticut Department of Correctional. Kathleen, she has a...
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the Guggenheim Foundation and John Jay very much for holding this wonderful seminar, and I'm really, really honored to be invited to speak. So I'm going to talk about 2 emails that I got this morning and give you a sense of what my life is like. I'm a physician, and I'm responsible for 14,500 patients, all of their medical, mental health, and substance use care in our system. So the first thing I got this morning was notification that we'd found a deceased parolee in his apartment with a needle and drug paraphernalia in his surrounds. Right, so a parolee who had overdosed on heroin or fentanyl, probably. The second email I got later in the day was from an attorney who's representing a client who's on methadone, who's going to be coming into our system, and he wants me to make sure that his client can continue on methadone. Now, those 2 emails don't seem related, but they are directly related. Because if I can't keep the attorney's client on methadone when he comes into my system, then I'm setting him up for overdose and death. That's reality. And I want to say that when it comes to prison reform, from my particular perspective, what we have to do is ensure that our jails and prisons provide the community standard of care for both all medical, mental health, and substance use disorder areas of treatment. And the other thing is, our particular philosophy is that we should not be incarcerating people because they are sick. And I'm going to show you a program that we built to try to stop incarcerating people because they are sick in the substance use disorder arena. So I'm going to go quickly. I have a few slides here, but I'm going to go through very quickly. We organize our work around the Gaines model, sequential intercept model, and that's a SAMHSA model, and it takes the criminal justice system along a continuum.
You may not know what SAMHSA is.
Oh, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. That's the federal government substance use disorder and mental health agency. You all have local ones in your states. That's the federal one. So I'm going to talk to you about a program that we have called Treatment Pathway Program at Intercept number 2, which is initial detention or court hearings. The second I talked about your reentry program that I want to talk to you about. So let's go quickly. I only put this in for 2 reasons. This is Treatment Pathway Program. This is a pre-arraignment diversion program that's currently located in Bridgeport, but we have 3 running because we got more funding because they're working very well. People with substance use disorders are diverted into treatment and not to jail. So far, this particular program started in April 2015, and so far we've treated around 300 people. So this is a graph showing screenings for this program versus treated. You can see sometimes the variation is big, sometimes it's small. That depends on a lot of things, but most of the time that depends on who's the judge. Kind of interesting. I've learned a lot about the criminal justice system. For an old physician, It's pretty interesting. Anyway, in 2017, I think we diverted 107 people. Why does this work? It works because somebody else mentioned this today, that you get people into treatment the same day they're diverted. You cannot wait 2 weeks to treat people with substance use disorders. You get them in the same day. 75% are within 1 day, and the average is like 1.01 days, so it's very little more than 1 day. So what do the results of this look like? So we get 69% of these people who have a non-incarceration sentence, and 8% of their sentences are nullied. So we keep many people out of jail who would have normally been in jail. This is a clinical assessment, and around 60% of them complete their clinical treatment course, which is 12 weeks, and some other things as well, and about 40% do not. This I just put in to show the impact of medication-assisted treatment in this group. This group, about half these people had alcohol use disorder as their main diagnosis, and the other half had opioid use disorder. As you can see, the people who get methadone, or in this case it was methadone, but there are other MAT drugs as well, 75% of them complete successfully, and a quarter do not. In the ones who do not, less than half complete their programs successfully. So medication is very, very important for opioid use disorder patients. This is the next intercept. This is our medication for addiction treatment programs in our jails and other facilities. We have 3 programs in jails running right now: Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport. We treat about between 80 and 100 people a day in these programs. We just got our license for an expanding program at York, which is our women's facility, and we are licensing a pre-release prison so that we will be able to do induction on people who come in and need treatment on the way out. This just shows our numbers from our first 2 programs. We started actually in 2013 in New Haven, 2014 in Bridgeport. We've treated about 1,000 people altogether in these 2 jail programs. Our Hartford program has just started within the last 2 weeks. We have actual controlled research study on the outcomes. This data was just published in the Journal of Addiction Medicine in January of 2018. And we looked at 3 things: behavior during the prison incarceration for people, methadone, MMT here just refers to methadone maintenance treatment, and post-release reengagement, and then qualitative interviews. Excuse me. In terms of disciplinary tickets, it's statistically significant lower number of disciplinary tickets in the group that was treated with methadone in the jail. So if you go to our warden right now, either one of them are in the 2 jails that have been programs that have been running for a while, they will tell you it is just much easier to run our jail because you do not have people withdrawing in the jail. You don't have people throwing up, having diarrhea, being agitated, starting fights. For custody staff, you will find that in our system, custody staff is the strongest advocate for these programs. Is that amazing? It is amazing because that's not normally where you see them coming down. This is reengagement with community providers, and again, statistically significant increases in both 1-day post-release reengagement and 30-day post-release reengagement. And finally, this is what recidivism looks like in this group. This is the reference category who reengaged. This is the group that did not reengage. All of these except new violent charges are statistically significant, and these are odds ratios for behavior that is in each one of those column heads. So clearly, these programs are effective, and they are effective using the test of peer-reviewed literature. A little bit of comments from some of the patients. I'm not sticking needles in my arm or breaking any laws. It saved my life, a chance to stay off street drugs, helped me stay alive, haven't done opiates since being in the program, kept me from losing my job. This is a medicine, in my opinion, that is just as important as insulin for a diabetic, just as important as an inhaler for an asthmatic. And then finally, this is a reentry program that's designed for those with moderate to severe substance use disorders, any kind of medical problems, and moderate to less mental health disorders. It's called the Living Free program. It's basically utilizes the concepts of collaborative care, and it's based on evidence-based practice. And it uses evidence-based addiction and mental health care, primary health care, and peer mentor support. And at the moment we have 2 of these programs. One's a Yale DOC-DEMAS partnership, and the other one is just a DOC program that we put in one of our communities. There are 4 key pieces of this program. The first is we run a query to identify people leaving. We identify them 6 months prior to release. We do 2 in-reach visits where people are recruited for the program. If anybody can attend, can be part of the program, they just have to say they want to be. And we essentially go in and talk to them about them and consent them. We also do an in-reach visit where a clinician meets with the patient and begins to develop a treatment plan. So the treatment plan for these patients is developed while they are still in custody. Then sometime between 2 and 4 weeks prior to release, these patients actually go to the clinic where they're going to be seen. It gives them a sense of identification of the clinic, where it is, and people meet. They have 4 one-hour appointments in that clinic, one with a psychiatrist, one with a psychologist, one with a social worker, and one with a peer advocate. And then these patients find their way to the clinic for community services immediately upon release. So I just have a few slides on the outcomes here. We have, at the moment, over 200 people enrolled. It's been running for 2 years, the program has. Interesting, the primary drug of choice is alcohol. The primary drug of choice in some of our other programs is alcohol too. Let's not forget about alcohol. It's a big problem for our population. Yes, opioids is big now, and just like we heard, other drugs are important as well. It's not just opioids. So we treat all substance abuse with this program. So most of these people are on parole or probation, and opioids, by the way, is the second highest drug of choice. I just want you to see what these patients' criminal history looks like. So 89% of them have been incarcerated multiple times. Notice that 67% are under this category of violation of parole or probation. Those are people who have substance use disorders mostly, who cannot be managed in the community because of their substance use disorder. That's what the Ohio the Ohio law is going to try to address. More power to you guys. We don't need to put these people in jail or prison. We don't do what we need to do for them there anyway. We're trying to do a better job of it, but across the country, you're not going to find the kind of care that people with serious substance use disorders need in a correctional system. So anyway, the other thing about this is, that 37% of this population has been incarcerated over 10 times. This is not a simple group to manage, right? These are people who are really sick with substance use disorders, and some other illnesses too. About 35% of this population has hepatitis C, for example. So out of this, some preliminary outcomes for this first group of patients, 94% engage in addiction treatment. So that means that 94% of the people, when they leave the corrections facility, and it's about half men and half women, 94% of them come to the clinic for care. That is remarkable. That's an amazing number, frankly. It's a tough population, and about 8 out of 10 successfully complete treatment. And treatment is 12 weeks. Many of the people actually extend their treatment, and because we're in a Medicaid expansion state and have a variety of other services from our local mental health and substance use agency, we can support their continued treatment. About 6 out of 10 of them have a psychiatric comorbidity. Remember when we set up the criteria for this group, they were not supposed to have any kind of mental health disorder. Well, it turns out that about 6 out of 10 of them do. And, and about half of them are receiving medicine for their mental health comorbidity. Through this program, 96% of them get housing, and about half get jobs. Which is, I think you have to understand that these people who have serious, moderate to severe substance use disorders, even if they've been incarcerated many, many times, they all have the potential to heal, to recover, to have jobs, to have families, to have homes. We have to remember that. Recovery is real for people. For the 29% that identify opioids as a drug of choice, about 80% of them are taking medication for their opioid use disorder. 3/4 on buprenorphine, so most of them are taking Suboxone. 22%, or 1 out of 5, on methadone, and 1 out of 25 on Vivitrol, extended release naltrexone. And they all get naloxone kits on their way out. So this is what the 6-month recidivism looks like for this population. Remember the numbers for the numbers of times these folks have been arrested and reincarcerated. 2% rearrest for men and 8% for women. And the 6-month recidivism of new incarceration is 0 for men and 0 for women. After a year and a half now, it's less than 5% reincarceration for both men and women. So the numbers are really very, very heartening for this program in terms of its effect in treating this population. So I just always like to put the acknowledgments of support, because it really takes a village to do any of these programs. And we have done these programs by cobbling together little bits of funding from various places. There are supposed to be $16 billion I heard two numbers, $16 billion or $13 billion coming out of the federal government to address the opioid epidemic within the next 2 years. Some of that money a chunk of that money needs to go to corrections to address substance use disorders in the correctional system. We have all these patients. 75–85% of our population has a substance use disorder requiring treatment. And we have this population, we have the opportunity to treat them within our setting. We need to be able to do that. So that's, and one last thing about the Heartland. So I happen to be from Montana, and I have a special spot in my heart for North Dakota, as I do for Montana. And the fact is that if I Google Montana methadone providers, I can find 3 in the entire state. If I Google that in Connecticut, I have probably 30, right? So there are real equity issues when it comes to treating patients for substance use disorders in, quote, the more rural areas than compared with places like I'm from. And even Vermont has issues. So it's not just where you're located in the country, but it's really what the kind of character of your population and your population distribution is. But we have huge challenges ahead. But if we never get started to solve them, we will never finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. So I'm not going to let you off so easily. There was a lot there. So first of all, I have a couple of follow-up questions. So you talk about medication-assisted therapy, methadone maintenance. You throw these terms around as if everybody knows it, and as if it's sort of what goes on in prisons and jails around the country. And I think you alluded in your final remarks to the fact that it doesn't. So could you give us a little bit of background about the fact that this is actually has been a somewhat contentious issue in the field, has it not?
Yes, so...
Tell us a little bit about what you mean when you say MAT,
Okay.
right? And,
Yes,
and
so...
what the previous practices were.
Yeah, so medication for addiction treatment. It's also called medication for medication-assisted treatment. There's like a dozen terms for it, but it refers to the use of medications for the treatment of opioid use disorder and other disorders as well, in addition to psychobehavioral counseling. So in the world of opioid use disorder, it's pretty clear that medications are required for more than 3/4 to 90% of the people who have an opioid use disorder for them to heal. For them to heal, right? So the standard of care is the use of medications for the treatment of this population. Generally, what correction systems do, and you know, we're in Connecticut, we're a unified system, so we've got a handful of jails and we've got about 10 prisons. In general, what jails do is they intake people who might be on heroin. Our Hartford jail, for example, every night, we do intakes 5 days a week. Every night we have between 3 and 10 people who come into Hartford on heroin, right? And it's about 1,100 person jail, so it's a relatively small jail compared to something like Rikers. But what we normally do is what people do is we quote detox, which is medical withdrawal is another term for that. We provide medication so people have a reasonable withdrawal from that. Some systems don't. They do what's called cold turkey. You just go withdraw yourself, right? Have all these terrible opioid withdrawal symptoms on your own. You'll get over it in 4 or 5 days. The other way to do that is with medically managed withdrawal, which is using medications to make those symptoms much less problematic. But then when these patients leave, they continue to have cravings. They don't have withdrawal symptoms anymore, but they continue to have cravings, and what they do is they go out into the community, and the first thing they're looking for is heroin, fentanyl, whatever. And the reason that we have such high overdose rates is because they lose their tolerance, and then they use, nowadays with fentanyl, it's anybody's game, right? Fentanyl is terrible. But they use heroin at the same dose that they take it and they overdose and die. That, you know, when we release people who have an opioid use disorder without any kind of medication to control cravings, we set them up for overdose death. That is wrong. That is not what we should be doing. It goes totally against any moral and ethical construct about caring for people, and it goes against the community's standard of care. So but I will say that in many, many facilities across the country, that's what's happening. And it's not always, so some of it is not enough education. We need a huge amount of education across our jails and prison systems. Some of it is resources. It's not free, right? You don't give this stuff away. It costs money, especially if you're going to use something like Vikrant or the new injectable buprenorphine. But so money, education, and then will. You have to have the will to do this. And I'm telling you, I'm seeing so many people in jails nowadays who are contacting me and saying, we want to do this. How do we go about doing it? How do we get these programs started? It's not rocket science, guys. It might take a few months to get it going, but this is not rocket science. This is very doable. And if you heard this morning about the Rhode Island experience, they've cut their number of unintentional overdose deaths in people who are releasing from their prison system by 60%. If you look at our state, 52% of the people who overdose and die from drug overdose have come out of our correction system. If we want to make an impact on this population, this is not rocket science either. We need to address substance use disorders in our correctional populations. Did I do okay?
Yes.
Okay.
And you put Leann on the spot, so Leann, let me ask you. So in North Dakota, you're not a unified system, which
No.
means the counties run the jails, you run the state prisons. Is there medication-assisted treatment in the county jails?
So we don't run the jails, but the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation has regulatory oversight over the jails, which is a nightmare because I'm not on the Christmas card list of a lot of sheriffs who run the county jails. Like Kathleen said, in North Dakota, like Montana, we only have 3 providers of methadone in the state, and that's fairly recent. So as we were getting ready, we knew that there's going to be people on methadone that are eventually going to find their way into prison. And we made a conscious effort to make sure that if someone came in on methadone, that we were going to find a way to continue them on. The concern, though, is at the jail level. So if you're in one of those 3 cities where you run a jail, fine, and those jails are actually bringing in the methadone treatment just like we are into our prison system. But if you're in a rural jail, which is the majority of them, that's the concern, is that those individuals are going to suffer some pretty horrendous withdrawals, and they do not have good medical services in some of those jails. So one of the things we're looking at is to do some sort of brainstorming with those jails and say, hey, if you can't support that person, move that person at least to a jail that could. Because we've had some really bad results of deaths in the jails because that withdrawal was not managed appropriately, and it's a horrible death for those individuals to go through.
Thanks. David, let me ask you the same question. So, is medication-assisted treatment available in Ohio? And if so, is it distributed the same in Toledo and Columbus and Cincinnati as it is in, I don't know, Southwest, down by the West Virginia line?
It depends on where you are, and we have also lots of horror stories about people dying, going through withdrawal, and they get nothing. It's just cold turkey. So it's unfortunately the way it is in the jails in North Dakota as well.
So I think this is, I mean, I think there's, as reporters, I think we need to be aware of this. This is not common practice in most jails, certainly not in New York. New York City Department of Corrections has run methadone maintenance and methadone-assisted withdrawal for many, many years, probably one of the first in the country. But the problem always has been that when prisoners leave the city jails in New York City to go to the state prisons, there's no continuation of the treatment. It's only now beginning to occur. Let me ask a couple of follow-up questions to get the conversation going. So, Leann mentioned the impact of the economic downturn, Adam, and that increased the appetite in North Dakota for reform, right? Had the economy not gone bust in 2008, do you think that you would have had the success that you've had with justice reinvestment?
Yeah, but not at quite the same level. Mark Holm had a good line a couple hours ago when he said that the budget situation, what did he say? It was the, we have 2 S words. You come for the savings, you stay for the salvation.
Right.
That's a much
Our budget
clever
director in
way.
New York years ago used to say nothing like a good budget crisis to stimulate the imagination.
So I think there's no question about that. I've often said that the savings are sort of the appetizer, not the main course. I like his formulation better. But for sure, that's what brought a lot of people to the table. But at the end of the day, we don't see legislatures in state after state, not quite yet Ohio, have to go the public ballot route there, but in a place like Louisiana, and Grace, I'm sure you're already telling people about just how deep and broad the reforms in Louisiana were with respect to drugs and other things. But so Marty, I think it's the longer view of this, and if I think back to my first career as a reporter, doing night cops at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and this was the height of the drug war. I mean, it was all about throwing guys on the ground, stomping them on their necks, and emptying their pockets, and worse. And that's what was happening, and nobody really challenged it. Nobody, frankly, in the neighborhoods where this was happening, was really challenged it. They wanted the Red Dog unit there. They wanted the drug guys off the corner by pretty much any means. And so when you think about the long sweep of this, we're in a very, very different place. It's not as far as it needs to be, and there are not as many methadone providers, whether it's in more rural states or others, but there really has been a dramatic change in attitudes toward addiction and drug-addicted offenders in particular, even if there's a long way to go. And if I could just say one more thing, I painted a pretty rosy picture a few minutes ago about this large number of states doing comprehensive reforms and everything, but I think it bears saying that the opioid epidemic in particular, and certainly the uptick in violent crime we've seen in the last couple of years, these are real challenges to the momentum in states, and a number of states, even those states that have done a lot of significant reforms, are finding that the folks who were opposed to these kind of reforms in the last 10 years or so, they've happened to have sort of been emboldened by these things and coming back and saying, hey,
Who could
we've got to
possibly be
crack down
opposed?
again. Well, prosecutors and sheriffs.
Oh. But what, so what? I mean, they're prosecutors and sheriffs. I mean, so do they carry that much weight?
Often they do, and this
Oh,
is
dear.
one of the reasons why a place like Ohio, you mentioned the judges before, the judges, it can be there. They can be frustrated by these things as well. I'll just say, in all honesty, we talk about second chances, but as the data we just saw show, we have 20% of these people that have been locked up 15 times
Right.
anymore. You're on the 17th chance, not the second chance.
Right.
And so people do get frustrated, and I think that impulse is understandable to say, we've tried treatment, we've tried it a million times, it's not working. So the tough thing about the debate, of course, is that, well, so this isn't going to work either. And when you look at it at so many levels, at an individual level, or even at sort of this big aggregate level, we put out some research last year. We're about to refresh it in a couple weeks, just showing at the big picture level, the state level, your state's drug imprisonment rate has no correlation whatsoever to your state's rate of drug use problems, and that is your state's rates of drug use, your overdose death rates, or your drug arrest rates, sort of three measures that are available out there that sort of give you a sense of how bad is a drug problem in the state. No correlation whatsoever. And so there are all kinds of evidence that simply locking up people doesn't work. But you understand the sheriffs and the prosecutors and often the judges who see these cases coming over and over again sometimes throw up their hands.
I want to come back to that point in a moment. Kathleen wanted to.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. Yeah, we can say that we've treated those guys that have been incarcerated 20 times, but we have not used evidence-based treatment. That's the fallacy with saying, oh, we've treated them a dozen times and they just don't want to get better. That is not the case. You have to use evidence-based care for people, especially people with opioid use disorders. You just don't use abstinence for those people and throw them into the community and expect them to do well. So I understand why people are frustrated, but let's be real. Let's take responsibility for appropriate evidence-based care for these patients. And you can see what the results look like on this Living Free program. You do evidence-based care, you get healing.
David, why? I'm assuming from what you said that the judges in Ohio are elected judges.
They are elected judges. I hate elected judges. I don't hate them personally, but the system is bad.
So could you say a little bit more about that? Why?
Yeah, well,
why should
let me
judges
give you-
supposed to be impartial?
If you watch TV election time and you see the judges who run for election and they're standing there with the Fraternal Order of the Police chair, they're talking about how they're going to be tough on crime, that's the problem. And then because of that, we are finding intense resistance to trying to do anything that looks like it's being soft on crime. Of course, it's not being soft, it's being smart. But they're not. It's easier for them to say, we want to send someone to the penitentiary than it is to say, here's how we're going to keep them in the community and keep the rest of us safe at a reduced cost. And it's hard. It's
Right.
very hard.
So, staying with that point, we were at lunch. One of the reporters who's here asked me about bail reform in New Jersey, and asked me about a recent case in which someone who had been who hadn't been jailed because of they did away with cash money bail, and went on to do something, I don't know, beat up his wife, did something terrible. So, he shot her in the head. Well, that's pretty bad. So there's risk.
There's
So, right, isn't it, at the end of the day, sort of who owns the risk?
Well, it is that, but here's the, I mean, don't run for office if you're not willing to stand and try and do the right thing. If you're going to be afraid that you're going to lose your election because you've taken the longer view, don't get in the business of running for office. I hated being a young public defender here in New York City after there'd be some horrible crime on the front page, because it meant your clients were not going to get out that night. And
Part of that problem?
absolutely, absolutely. If it bleeds, it leads, and you know that's part of what drives a false narrative often of how much crime we have in our communities. Absolutely, it's part of the problem. So don't be part of the problem.
Right, none of us are God, right? We make decisions, and we make them by our best lights, using our best evidence-based practices, but we're not always right. And bad stuff is gonna happen, and let's not all go into a moral panic when it does.
Right, right. And bail reform is something that is a part of the problem in Ohio, trying to get judges to want to change and be part of the solution on that.
So Vikrant, I did a little bit of research, and recently I think you were interviewed by Michelle Martin on NPR, a program called Tell Me More, and you said this. You said it's obvious that if you lock more people up, you're going to have less crime, just because you've incapacitated people. But of course, the problem is that at a certain point, you're going to get diminishing returns. You can just start locking up far too many people, and you'd find that those dollars could be more wisely spent elsewhere, maybe in programs that would reduce recidivism rates. So my question to you is, are there specific programs? And my dad, who was a traveling salesman, always said to me, he was very unhappy that I went to public service. He said, you have to spend money to make money. So where does the money for those programs come from? Does government have to ante up first to achieve savings later by getting the reductions? Or what always troubled me when I was running a corrections agency, and maybe Leann can speak to this as well, is they say, oh, we're going to take $10 million out of your budget to fund X, but meanwhile I still have the same number of prisoners to feed and clothe and house. So any thoughts about what comes first, the cart or the horse?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say about that is very frequently what happens is policymakers are not facing the decision to either spend money on programs and things like that, or to not spend money at all. They're facing a different decision. It's, do we spend this money, the small amount of money, on programs and treatment, those things, or do we spend a large amount of money on incarceration? That's the decision they tend to face. And in fact, Adam mentioned these 2007 reforms in Texas, which I'm sure many of the people in the room are familiar with because they're a very famous story in criminal justice circles. But that's a great example of this kind of thing. The legislators had people come before them and say, okay, what we've been doing in Texas for 20, 30 years, whenever we face crime difficulties, is we just incarcerate. So we're facing some of these problems right now. Let's build some more prison beds. It's going to cost $2 billion. On the other hand, you had advocates from the other side saying, no, a better way to handle this problem is to look into things like better treatment, better rehabilitation, some of these other options. That would only cost you about $300 million. They spent a much smaller amount, and they got much better results in terms of incarceration and in terms of public safety. So in that sense, sure, you do need some money up front, but the decision is not spend or don't spend. It's often spend a whole lot on prisons, or spend a little bit less but more effectively on programs. And a quick note on, since the first part of that question is, what kind of programs. I'm not going to say anything that will surprise anybody, but the big three are job training, drug and alcohol treatment, and definitely mental health treatment. I will say maybe you'd be surprised how tiny little fixes in the heartland that don't cost that much money can make a huge difference. Here's a very small example of the kind of thing that I have in mind. Everybody knows that Texas is huge, it's a colossal state, it's bigger than any other state other than Alaska. And yet, for a long time, I don't know if this is still the case, there was one van that would drive around all over the state to provide driver's licenses that would laminate to people who were coming out from behind bars, identifications, not driver's licenses necessarily. And you know that in order to get a job when you come out from behind bars, you gotta have an ID. It sounds like the smallest thing in the world, has nothing to do with drug treatment, alcohol treatment, any of these kinds of things, but it's so important. You don't have that ID, you're not gonna get hired, you're not gonna get an interview. And there was just this one little truck, not driving around Rhode Island, driving around Texas. You just put forth a little bit more money for more trucks and more drivers of those trucks, make a big, big difference. Those are the kinds of little things that exist out there that we should be looking for that would cost a little bit of money, but boy, they would make a difference.
Thank you. So I'd like to throw the conversation open to the larger group. And somebody will have microphones, so any questions? Yes, right in the middle.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much.
Wait for the mic.
Could you just introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Thomas I. McDonald. I'm a reporter with the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was just wondering, what if any challenges, we'll say does the private corrections industry pose to sentencing reform or even drug treatment behind bars? You had mentioned that the building of prisons was an important economic development element.
Yeah, I would compare the economic boon that county jails were getting as far as economic development to what happens with private prisons. Luckily, we don't have we don't have a presence of private prisons, although we do have our women's prison is a contract facility, but it's not a private for-profit prison. I think it's there. I think they, I don't want to demonize them. They can do some good things. But when you have a profit motive, that's a real factor in paying, in some of these states that have a large presence, they absolutely are funding policymakers not to go down the path of criminal justice reform. And they have a good argument because they can read on the fear and the unique and weird crime that drives policy rather than good sound judgment. So when we talk about policy reform in this area, it's very driven by emotion sometimes, where even all the best data and graphs and visualization does not get past that emotion and that need for a pound of flesh. So there definitely is a piece of that actually keeps some of those reforms from going forward.
Thanks.
Yeah, just a couple points of information and then maybe a tip. In all our work across the state over the states over the past decade or so, we really have not run into an aggressive private prison lobby working against sentencing law changes or changes in really anything that we've done. It's really not been there on the adult side. I mean, you look at the numbers, they've been bouncing around between 6, 7, 8%, maybe 9% of the total state prison population is in private facilities. It's not gone up higher than that. And you might think that that's too much, but that's sort of where it is, right? It's just not been a huge driver of the adult prison population over time. In fact, I think there's quite a strong argument that unions have been much bigger driver and direct advocates, particularly out in California, for policies that drive up prison populations. The tip would be that not so on the juvenile side. And it's been fascinating as we've started and expanded this model over to the juvenile side. All these adult states, I should have mentioned earlier, we've been in 7 states on the juvenile side. We're in Alabama and Tennessee right now as well. The providers of juvenile residential facilities, some are nonprofit, some are for-profit, are very aggressive and very open in their lobbying to keep kids in these facilities. And as far as I know, except with the possible exception of Florida, pretty unexplored by reporters in terms of that dynamic.
And in fact, I think people don't recognize that juvenile corrections is far more far more privatized than adult corrections in every state. Far larger proportion of the juvenile population in each state is managed by private operators.
I was just gonna say, Marty, on the lucrative side, the adult prisons are about $30,000 a bed or so. The best estimate we have about $30,000 a year per bed, 3 times that on the juvenile side.
Yes, sir. Right down here. Oh, well, okay, back there. I guess I got overruled. We need a mic down
The
front.
rule of the mic. Mark Obie, I'm a freelance journalist. We've heard a lot about drugs, but not a lot about violent crime and sentencing of for violent offenses. And I'm wondering, in fact, that's been one of the criticisms of justice reinvestment and the reform movement in general. John Pfaff of Fordham did the math and said that we really can't bring the population down to the level that reformers hope for without talking about violent crime. So are we not talking about it because we got the sentencing levels just right, or is it because it's just politically too hard?
I'll just say quickly, it is obviously much harder, but I think the dam has broken in a number of senses. In Louisiana, for example, this past year, there were a number of reforms that speak to sentence lengths and time served for violent offenses. You can go back even to 2009 in Georgia, where Georgia has a law called the 7 Deadly Sins Law, right? Not to be outdone by they already had 2 strikes, so they had to come up with something to top that. So it was 7 Deadly Sins. And there's 7 crimes for which it is two strikes and you're out. The first offense is mandatory minimum 10 years. The second offense is 25 to life. But even several years ago, they recognized that there has to be a transition period, and they actually went back in, and something was really thought of as a third rail for policymakers dealing with not only just violent offenses, but what they call the worst of the worst, and to say, hey, you can actually spend the last year of a 7 Deadly Sins sentence in a transition center, because we recognize that. So I don't mean to say that the conversation is where it needs to be, and the evidence is similar on the violent offender side as it is on the nonviolent drug offender side with respect to the lack of correlation between length of stay and recidivism rates. But it's not happening at all.
I would agree that you have to address the violent offenders in your system. I always look, when you talk about risk, there's a risk to recidivate, and then there's dangerousness. And we're talking, some of my drug offenders are way more risky, probably a lot less dangerous, as someone that commits a heinous crime that was really driven by whatever reason. I would take a risk on some of those individuals by letting them out of prison, probably, and if you look at California, that's a good example. Their governor has actually placed a number of those individuals in for murder out and paroled them. And they have it's a very, very minute portion that actually reoffends. But I think the dialogue is different. So a lot of policymakers always term it as, oh yeah, we're gonna deal with the low risk nonviolent individuals. Some of the biggest reforms we made in North Dakota actually went towards that. We actually reduced the number of crimes that were subject to 85% rule. But it was done so under the radar that there wasn't a lot of hype about it, but that's probably one of the things that's having the most dramatic effect on some of the individuals in our system.
Anyone else?
I'll just say briefly, first of all, thanks for that question. Every time I utter nonviolent, low-level crime, I want to gag, because I feel like I'm throwing people under the bus when I do that. Human beings, I feel like I'm throwing under the bus. I agree that it's harder to talk about it, but we still have to have those conversations. And one of the things that we try and do in Ohio is get as many legislators as possible to actually go into prison and meet people who are serving long sentences, because what gets lost is the humanity of people. And if we can show and remind people that we're talking about human beings, somebody's daughter, son, father, mother, it'll make it easier to get reform for people serving long sentences. So thanks for your question.
Yes, and I might add, I suspect that it's true that in just about every state, there's a statutory provision that gives state legislators an absolute right to come in and visit prisons if not prisons and jails, and probably judges and DAs too. And it's a fair question to ask elected officials how often they've done that.
Hi, so I'm Paul Heaton from the Quantrill Center at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. So I wanted to dig in a little bit to some of the numbers. So Adam, you talked about this, kind of Texas experience, which is familiar. 50,000 prisoners in '87, up to 150 by 2007, now down to about 120. Leann, you talked about a 250% increase in your correctional population. So the question I have is, so we point to Texas as this big success story, but of course, crime, if we think back to Al's presentation, if we were to look across a broader set of crime is lower today than it was in 1987, and yet, we still have 70,000 more individuals incarcerated. Is there any possibility for us to get back to the world we were in previously, before the 250% increases, or is that kind of in the past and that's never achievable again?
There was a political answer to that question. There's a math answer to the question. The easy one, I think, is the math. 53% of state prison inmates are in for violent offenses, to the previous question. So if you're talking to cut 50, and to get back to where you were, you have to do more than cut 50, but you could empty out the prison of every single drug offender, not possession, but trafficking and so on, every single one, every single property offender, and you would still get to cut 50. 8 states in this country have 50% of prisoners. So you could zero out the other 42 states. Nobody in prison in those 42 states. And you have to do that in order to get to 50%. The other thing, and I wish we crunched some numbers on this, is that there are, and this is from the Sentencing Project, 11% of state prisoners at this point are lifers. And my guess is, this is what we should have crunched by now, but if you added people who were sentenced to a term of years, say 25 years or more, and then looked at people 20 years or more, 15 years or more, my guess is 50% of the people have sentences of maybe 10 years or more. So unless those serious, chronic, violent inmates are going to have some kind of retroactive relief, which seems unlikely, then you really are looking at fairly high levels of incarceration for some period of time. The resident population of the U.S., of course, is creeping up, and that's why we're seeing the incarceration rate drop faster than the prison population itself, and I think that's meaningful for obvious reasons as well, but that's kind of the math of it. Talk about politics.
I don't think it'll get back to that, and one of the reasons is digital media. I mean, it's out there, and so I think there's just this hyper awareness of everything bad that happens, and that's what sells. So, for example, I used to be a prosecutor, and sex crimes used to get a fraction of the length of sentence that they do now, and there's a lot of anxiety and hoopla and hypersensitivity around sex offenders to the point where that is probably one of the fastest growing pieces of our correction system is these sex offenders that when you ask that question, someone asked it during lunch, what about the sex offenders? That is a really, really difficult population to apply everything we know about successful reentry. We deny their employment opportunities, we apply them stable housing. And so we put all these things around them so that it just becomes like, well, let's just leave them sitting in prison. And so I don't think we're going to get back to where we were because of just the amount of attention on some of these more sensitive types of crimes.
Let me ask you a crime, because all right, so Texas is down from 150 to 120 or whatever it's at. Maybe it'll never get back to 50, but is there a pathway to 100?
Okay, so
Try the other mic, maybe that one works clearly, so.
Okay, so this one works. I I'm going to give a really unsatisfying answer, but hopefully it's interesting at least. So the unsatisfying answer is I don't know. The world is unbelievably complex, and it's really difficult to prognosticate those kinds of things. Here's a story that's going to sound random, but I promise I'm going somewhere with this. There is this interesting book out by this academic, I think in San Diego. Her name is Jean Twenge, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Jean Twenge, maybe. It's about smartphone addiction among teenagers, basically, and about how it is just ravaging their mental health in so many different ways. It's absolutely fascinating. I haven't read the book. I read a huge excerpt in The Atlantic, which was like the most forwarded piece on The Atlantic's website all of last year. I highly recommend at least the article to everybody. And she makes the argument, which a lot of people here probably know intuitively, that all sorts of things are happening to teenagers' minds because they're just too obsessed with digital media, smartphones and things. But here's what else is happening. Teen pregnancy rates have plummeted in this country. That's a good thing. Now, I don't know, there's a weird trade-off there. Is it such a good thing that we're comfortable with the mental health problems that are coming with it? I don't know. It's a really, really difficult story. Here's where I'm going with all of this. Yeah, we're having lots of problems with digital media and obsession over things that if they bleed, they lead. But what if it's also possible that young men who commit the vast majority of crimes spend a lot more time playing video games or on the internet as the years continue to go by in the future? And if because of this weird reason, which has nothing to do with criminal justice on its face, crime rates start to plummet and then incarceration rates start to plummet. I have no idea. The world is very, very complex. There are all of these things that happen sociologically and psychologically that are unrelated to day-to-day criminal justice policy, but they will affect it. I don't know. I will say I'm an optimist. There's an academic who teaches just a few blocks south of here named Mark Kleiman, and many of you probably know him. He teaches at NYU. Mark and I were having a drink one evening, and I said to him, gosh, these cut 50 people seem really aggressive. I mean, can we really cut 50%? And he said, Vikrant, in the 1960s, we had rates of incarceration that were 80% lower than what we have right now. Those cut 50 guys are pikers. So he's optimistic. I'm happy to be optimistic too, but I don't ultimately know.
Al? Where's the microphone?
Oh, I have it.
Oh, I was, Al has.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. I'll be quick. I'm Zach from the Fair Punishment Project. Don't know if this is on. Okay. So this is for David about the judges. So the judges in Ohio throwing the book at people. So most people in their communities don't know their DA, their prosecutor, or their judges, and these are elected officials. What kind of stories, what kind of media stories would make people care about these people who are the gatekeepers to the justice system?
Exposés. That's something that could help. I mean, we've got judges on, for example, on our Court of Appeals who don't work hard. They always side with the government, and I understand that, of course, on appeal it's much tougher, but they're out of the building at noon on a lot of days, right? And that offends a lot of people's notions of, you know, we elected you to do your job and you're taking it easy. On the bail reform issue, for example, there are a number of people in our community, and I'm just talking specifically about Hamilton County, who don't think it makes sense to lock up people charged with misdemeanors just because they can't afford bail. And yet they don't know, because we haven't done a good enough job publicizing it, and the media hasn't picked up on it enough, that the judges are part of the problem with that. And so I think we've got to expose judges who fight tooth and nail to waste taxpayer dollars. In the part of the country where I am now, saving taxpayer dollars is certainly something that people care about. Obviously, people also care about being safe, and so there's that tension there. But I think exposing how judges are not applying common sense is certainly something that's really important.
Or calling them out for not implementing the public health approach.
Absolutely.
When people care about that.
They do care about
Because
that.
there's a lot of progressive rhetoric, we can't arrest our way out of this, yet we keep hearing there's a public health response, and what I'm seeing is
Same old, same
a
old.
lack of a public health response, yeah.
Yes.
I want to get one more question, and the last question to
It's
Mr.
been
Brunson.
really encouraging to see the movement in this panel going in the directions of improving that we've seen over the last 20 years or so, despite the signals that are coming from Washington. And to what extent are you seeing those signals from Washington mobilizing opposition to the programs and the progress that you all are making? And the second question, we've been improving the drug treatment and rethinking the whole heavy-handed drug response, but we have been keeping the federal drug offender population at 50% rather steadily, and the state population rather steadily at about 16%. How come those have not been coming down?
I'll make just a quick observation on the politics. We've seen no evidence so far that anything happening in Washington, D.C. is negatively influencing what's happening in the states. It's probably positively influencing it, but actually the more appropriate way to phrase that is that the causality happens in the opposite direction. So many wonderful things have been happening at the state level, have been happening in red states in particular. So the red administration in the White House has paid attention, has noticed that, and has taken an interest in it, and has taken an interest in what they can do, particularly in the area of reentry, to transfer good reentry ideas that are being implemented in the red states to the federal government. So on that level, at least, we just have really, really encouraging signs.
I agree. I think Ron is absolutely right. It's kind of hard to imagine that there's not some chipping away here that's happening, and some emboldening of people who are already opponents and feeling like they can go maybe a little bit stronger. We certainly are seeing rollback efforts in places like Alaska. There's a lot of saber rattling going on in Louisiana right now. Folks who want to come back after this the bill passage just 6-8 months ago now and revisit those things. It's a little hard to see how this is the rhetoric coming from inside the Beltway is not affecting that. At the same time, you had Louisiana move forward in the spring of last year and passing and signing a bill, a package of bills. I think it was 6 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and an independent sponsoring this package of 10 bills, despite all that. And they were a very aggressive, comprehensive series of reforms that really, I think, made the statement that Ron was saying, which is that we're here doing our own thing. We've seen the evidence about this working in the states, and that maybe the federal system is a different thing, but we're not going to let that knock us off track.
So, this says 5:15.
Al's second question was an answer to the federal population. Why they say that?
I think that's probably because nobody here knows what the answer is.
On
Why the federal, the percentage of drug offenders in the federal system has remained impervious to change.
And the states. States are pretty stable at 20%, 16% now.
There's a couple things. You have to build out significant diversion programs, whether it's in the drug courts or otherwise. And I don't think we're there yet. I think this little diversion program that we've set up, that's going to be expanded significantly, is one answer. You have to have system-wide diversion programs, and you have to have system-wide programs to provide the appropriate treatment for patients when they leave. So I know that the federal government, the federal BOP, does not have effective, well, I won't say they don't have effective, they just don't have MAT programs for patients when they're leaving. They've tried a couple of Vivitrol pilots, but they've had difficulty, because think about it. You've got, I don't know, many prisons in the federal system, people returning, re-entering all over the country. It's a huge logistics challenge for those folks to build out the right kind of treatment on re-entry. And when you don't do that, people just come back. It's just the nature of this disease. Same with states, but states have an easier time of it.
Okay, one more. Do we have a mic?
No, there's the light.
I don't know which states still execute other than Texas, but it's a known fact that the capital punishment costs tons of money. So in terms of right on crime fiscally wise, is it a time to finally abolish the capital punishment?
Easy last question.
Yes. Connecticut abolished capital punishment several years ago, and it was a wonderful thing for the state to do, and the whole country should do it. That's my personal opinion.
That's my opinion too. We still execute people in Ohio, and we're botching executions in Ohio, and it's just wrong.
Florida's.
No, I just said we're.
You said it's wrong, they're botching executions.
Well, executions are wrong in my personal view, and besides that, there've been some high-profile botched executions. It's just a horrible thing to do, and I think we should get rid of it.
On that note, thank you to this panel.
Thank you, Marty, for a very strong way to end up. So, those of you who are coming to dinner, we're at 7 p.m. downstairs in the student cafeteria, second floor.